Hi, everyone. So today we're going to talk about a topic that is not very much talked about, or as much as I would like to talk about it. And that is, regulatory agencies in particular, with the Department of Real Estate as it applies to agents and brokers. So let's get into it. So, as an attorney, I've been dealing with a lot of regulatory agencies, helping brokers and agents deal with inquiries, accusations, and I'm very familiar with the process and how that process works. So I'm here to give some pointers on that and of the importance of having counsel to assist you when you get an inquiry or an accusation from the Department of Real Estate. So why does DRE investigations matter, right? DRE investigations are often misunderstood as informal. And why? Because you get a letter, hey, provide me your transaction documents, and that's pretty much it. Um, some of those requests include documents, written responses, and sometimes interviews. And sometimes it could be all of them. Sometimes they start with an interview, depending on the office that they're in or the location they're in. Sometimes they start with a document inquiry, which then leads to an interview. So it really depends. And in reality, they can lead to formal disciplinary action. So never assume that just merely cooperating, you're off the hook. Every investigation is a potential entry point into enforcement action because what's happening with that is they're looking at your responses, looking at your production to see if there's anything that supports essentially what the complaint is about or what they received. And if it does, then that's where things get more complicated. They look more into it, and then it could potentially lead to enforcement action. So, how I recommend brokers and agents to treat an inquiry, right? That letter that you get from the DRE that, we received a complaint, and in regard to this transaction, oftentimes they don't even really tell you what the complaint is about. They might imply, but a lot of times they won't. And so they're just asking you for essentially your transaction documents or maybe potentially an interview. So approach every DRE contact with the same seriousness as litigation, assuming everything you say or submit may resurface later or it turn into an enforcement action. Early missteps can shape the entire case, and do not over explain. Really understand what's being asked of you and only answer what is truly being asked in the inquiry. The way I say to look at this is like a demand letter that you get in a lawsuit, right? A demand letter is not a formal complaint, but it is a letter that is kind of putting you on notice that this person is upset, they're seeking remedy, and if they don't get the result they want, then they're going to file a complaint. And this is kind of similar. The only difference is you're dealing with the Department of Real Estate and they're not making a monetary demand, they're making a document or informational demand, and they will take that, their investigators will assess the what you provided in comparison to the complaint and see if there's a case. And if there is, then things may escalate from there. So deadlines and documents. You want to meet every deadline, but you also don't want to rush, right? And so you want to make sure that you are very familiar with the deadline, when it's due. Open that communication up with the special investigator who sent you the inquiry. Make sure that if you need more time, that you send in an extension request. And a lot of time they're very gracious and they will provide you the extension as long as they know that you are acting and working in good faith in cooperating. A single rushed, careless response can create long-term problems, and that's really common, right? Because a lot of brokers and agents underestimate these types of inquiries. They sometimes just say, "Oh, let me just drag and drop all of these transaction documents and be done with it," right? They're not really actively or intentionally providing things. They're just hitting copy and submit. And so that's really where you want to be careful. This is why it's also important to keep records complete, accurate, and organized. So besides the fact that you should always have your records organized, there could be a lawsuit, but it's also important for the same reason for regulatory agencies. If you have all of your, documents in order, your correspondence, your transactional documents, then making these productions will be much easier. It will be less likely that you're going to unintentionally provide something that you shouldn't be, right? Because you're being organized, you know what you're providing, you know where your documents are, and so forth. So here's the risk of doing this alone. Is a lot of times, for one, you don't know these things, right? As a broker and agent, you might not have the time, right? So you're just sending things and without even giving it a second thought. Or it's just you don't know how you should be responding. You don't know what your rights are. You don't know what defenses you may have. You may not be able to read in between the lines as to what the complaint is about and what the DRE is fishing for, right? Those are the kinds of lens that a counsel who is familiar with these types of regulatory agencies, in particular with whatever industry they're in, for example, here being in real estate and being dealing with the Department of Real Estate, it's really important. You truly do have a different lens that many brokers and agents just don't. So my recommendation is always, always seek counsel early. Unintended admissions of wrongdoing are very common, right? You just think you're talking to your colleague, but really that's the Department of Real Estate. It's like it's their what I call, think about it as a plaintiff's counsel, right? They're there for the purpose of the DRE. They are not there for you. Overproduction of documents exposing unrelated issues. Again, whether you unintentionally, by accident, just didn't take it seriously, provided things that really they weren't asking for, but you provided it anyways because you don't want to sit there and look through documents. Maybe it's even related to a different transaction than the one that they're asking about. Well, all of that can just enhance exposure, right? Because now you're providing things that they're not even looking for or seeking, but yet they might come across an issue and now it can definitely escalate into something much larger. So missed defenses. So, missed defenses is interpreted in two ways. So when you deal with the Department of Real Estate, typically there are two what I call steps. Step one is the inquiry. And the inquiry is just there, it's not a complaint, it's just like a demand letter. Here's what we're looking for. At that stage, again, that counsel lens that I was referring to, of being able to really read in between the lines of what it is that the DRE is seeking or fishing out, right? Really helps formulate the response. And as counsel who's been dealing with the Department of Real Estate, right, I know what the Department of Real Estate looks for in responses and what they are seeking that would be acceptable, right? Definitely, for example, accountability, mitigation, and those kinds of things are really important to show, which, a lot of agents and brokers may not be aware of. Now, if you're dealing with the second part of the DRE investigation and is the accusation itself, that's when you get a formal complaint from the Department of Real Estate, right? That there are certain ways that you're supposed to respond, right? You're not just supposed to respond to the complaint, just like a normal civil lawsuit where you get an attorney. And if you've ever seen a response, there's usually a bunch of affirmative defenses. Well, Department of Real Estate has similar procedures and similar defenses that are unique for these procedures. So it's really important that you are aware of what and how you are responding. And that's where counsel can really be valuable. Um, so increase exposure in civil litigation or insurance disputes. It doesn't, in as far as the Department of Real Estate, you just don't want to have a ding on your record, right? You don't want to unintentionally expose yourself to liability. It doesn't necessarily mean that it might, open a can of worms in other forums, but it could potentially, it just doesn't look good. So you really, really want to, in the early stages of these investigations, get rid of them, right? And that's really the goal, is the sooner you get rid of them, the better. You don't want to have a disciplinary action on your hands because now, you're not dealing with someone just demanding money, right? Which on its own could be its own issue. You involve your insurance. A lot of people don't have insurance for disciplinary or administrative type claims. And so, they're on their own. And so you don't have that, right? And so you really want to get rid of it as soon as possible without costing you too much money. But at the same time, spending that little extra money on the be in the beginning for your attorney to deal with this can really save you so much money down the line and so much headache and potentially your business, right? Again, I'm not talking about civil liability of just monetary exposure now. We're talking about your license as a real estate broker. I know that is the most valuable thing that you hold, and it's what makes your business, go round and round. So that should be, very important. You guys should always take that seriously. So let's walk through how an attorney would, or how like myself would come on and take this. You send an inquiry to me and or an accusation. And again, we act as, contact with investigators. This also puts the investigator on notice that you guys are protected. There's somebody, you're taking this seriously. They cannot push you around and try to, get unnecessary information, right? You've hired counsel, someone who's familiar with this. This is their job. They're there to protect you. And so it really does shift dynamics. Ensuring communications are accurate and consistent, right? So when you're dealing with a Department of Real Estate or any other regulatory agency, right, truthfulness is always the best policy, right? You always want to be truthful. You always want to be very transparent, right? You want to be cooperative. But it's really like anything else, it's really important of how you do that, right? And how you properly respond, whether it's to an accusation, did you assert your right defenses, or if it's an inquiry, are you really understanding what they're looking for? Are you properly answering? Are you over sharing information that they're not even asking for? Are you not sharing enough, right? There really is a key to this, and unfortunately, unless you been through the ringer, you wouldn't know otherwise. So counsel will also go in there and respond strategically to documents. So like when I was telling you earlier, where you just drag your documents over and you're like, okay, here's, boom, 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 all my transaction documents, here you go. As counsel, I read their inquiry. I look to see what it is that they're looking for. And so when I go, I review your transaction documents with that lens in mind of what it is that they're looking for. I provide an assessment of this is what they're potentially looking for. This is how it looks, right? So you also get some idea of what it is. For one, but two, where it could potentially go, and if there has been an issue. So, that's a really thorough, intentional way of reviewing documents, and then with that lens, providing what is truly being asked from the Department of Real Estate. And again, going to the anticipation of investigation, right? As brokers, you kind of get eager when you get one of those inquiries. You're like, what is this about, right? And a lot of times they're not very transparent of exactly what the complaint is and who made the complaint, right? You're kind of there reading in between the lines, connecting the dots between this transaction, this property, who did what, who represented who was the buyer, who was the seller, right? So you really get, you know, you really have to put the dots together. And so we help you do that, and in reviewing your documents in the lens of this is what we think the DRE is looking for. This is where you are, right? We think this is problematic. We think this is not, you're good, you're in the clear. This is how we're going to respond. That strategy and clarity that you get from your counsel in this, this time of uncertainty is always important. And last but not least, again, preserving defenses and minimizing risk, right? Minimizing risk as to the inquiries, right? Not oversharing, being transparent with the DRE and showing, accountability if there needs to be accountability, showing mitigation if there needs to be mitigation, right? And really investigating the matter and intentionally responding. And then if it's an accusation, obviously preserving defenses similar like you would do with, any civil lawsuit. So, what is the best outcome, right? The best outcome of an inquiry is when you get a closure letter from the DRE. And that basically says, we looked into this matter. Thank you for providing everything to us. We have reviewed everything and everything looks good. And we are going to close our investigation. That is the best case scenario in an inquiry stage, right? So, you completely avoid formal disciplinary action. And that's what every broker and agent should want to achieve. And many investigations do close before accusation. But again, it's really important what it is. First of all, it's really important what the allegations are, what the potential issues are, right? Some issues are more serious than others. But also even more importantly, is how you respond to them. Because if an issue that they're seeking, right, or they're looking into, may not be that big of an issue in the light of the DRE. And as counsel, right, we know what is really important to the DRE, what is really problematic. And unless you've been in those cases, you've dealt with the DRE, you really don't know. You may assume everything is a big deal, and you're going to lose your license, or nothing is a big deal because it's never happened to me, and you might not think much of it. So, the goal is always to get rid of these before an accusation is filed, and early involvement is the key to that, right? The early involvement, the really intentional way of responding to these inquiries, the cooperation, the professionalism, the DRE does really appreciate that. And I always say, right, prevention is better than prevailing at a hearing, right? Unfortunately, a lot of times, when people get in trouble for either civil lawsuit, criminal, disciplinary, whatever it is, right, in any forum, that's when they think about, oh, I need to get an attorney, right? Because now you have a formal action. But as an attorney who's been doing this for many years, I always say, especially with real estate, right? There's a lot of exposure in real estate, especially in California, because there aren't really attorneys overlooking those transactions. So there's a lot of exposure for brokers and agents, with the complexities of the California laws, the various California laws, the constantly changing laws. It's really important to have early involvement when you just feel like there isn't a dispute coming about, right? Because that really does de-escalate and prevent. And that could, although you may think, well, I have to spend money for an attorney to do that. Yes, but the amount of money you would have to spend for preventative work is almost always less than what you would spend for reactive work, which is when you hire us for an actual, lawsuit or a disciplinary action. The amount spent is always going to be significantly different. So the takeaways of this is DRE investigations are never informal or inconsequential, even though it may seem that way, right? Statements and documents can follow you beyond the investigation. So treat a DRE inquiry with seriousness of a lawsuit. Early legal guidance protects your license and your reputation. Again, your license as a broker and agent is the most valuable thing that you hold in your business because without it, you can't do what you're doing, right? And so you should always, always take that seriously. I know for me, that's the approach I would do, right? If it was a personal matter in relevance to me, I would always take that approach. That's the same advice I would give to everybody else. So, again, you want to have a DRE response plan in place. You want to have that go-to attorney or law firm that you could just ring and say, hey, I just got this inquiry. Can I send it your way? We have a lot of, brokerages who do that, who have us, on retainer. And if they get an inquiry, they just send it our way. We deal with them. And, in really great cases and almost in a lot of cases, right, we give them the best news, which is a closure letter. So it's really, really important that you have that go-to law firm that you can just call or send these their way and have them manage and deal with the DRE on your behalf. Again, our firm is, well equipped in dealing with disciplinary actions. Again, not a lot of firms, a lot of firms who have litigation experience, that doesn't necessarily mean they have disciplinary action experience. It's a two different types of forum. Every agency is also different, right? Medical board, Department of Real Estate, they could be different. So it's a really small area of, expertise. So it's really important that not to just hire any attorney, but an attorney that has the knowledge and the prerequisite of dealing with disciplinary actions in these forums. So I think that's the key here, and it's really important that whoever you hire has that background. And this is one aspect that we as a firm deal with a lot. So, anything related to the Department of Real Estate is definitely where we can step in and shine. And again, if you guys have any other questions or any of these, Department of Real Estate inquiries, action plans that you need in place, feel free to contact our firm and we'll be happy to help.